When one thinks of aircraft carriers, they may first think about something like this, the Nimitz. A large, powerful airbase with 90 aircraft, charging around the world, able to project power at will. Or perhaps, if they're historically inclined, they think of the great flat tops of World War II, be it American or Weebish if you are of the anime persuasion. That's not a racial dig, that's a dig at people who watch anime. Keep up. But, rarely though, do they think about these. Paddle wheel low-slung lake freshwater carriers. It's certainly a departure from the norm, but why do they exist? Well, let's find out. Welcome back to 5-Minute History, the weekly series where patrons choose the topic. This time we're going to be discussing the aircraft carriers on the Great Lakes, courtesy of Link. You'll never guess that he's from the Great Lakes. At the start of World War II, the United States found itself on the back foot when it came to carrier air power. Of course, the events of December 7th kind of imply this is obvious. However, one thing a lot of people don't realise is just how far behind the Americans became. In the Pacific, the United States had the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, and Hornet, with the Ranger and the Wasp in the Atlantic. Facing those carriers, though, was the Kiribati, and this included, but was not limited to, the Soryu, Hiryu, Akagi, Kaga, Zuikaku, Shokaku, and then an entire wave of light carriers such as the Ryujo, and more. In short, the US had a problem. A big problem, because all these Japanese air groups were also highly trained and veterans of the China campaigns. This gets worse too when you consider that within just over a year, Hornet, Wasp, Lexington and Yorktown were on the bottom of the ocean, and the others were damaged. For a time, only Enterprise was able to sail, and briefly the US became so desperate it borrowed a British carrier under the pseudonym USS Robin. But that's just the hulls. Of course, in time the Essex Swarm would make up for their losses, but there's a big but here. What about the planes? A carrier is only as effective as its air group, and US carrier groups had been so decimated only a core of highly skilled pilots remained and a lot of recruits. So what did the US do? It recalled the experienced pilots away from the fight where they were desperately needed, for an even more important job, teaching cadets on a lake, and at the centre of that was flight deck training. See, it's fine if you're a pilot and you land at an airfield a little short or a little over in this time period, you run off a little bit when taxiing onto the grass. I mean, the runway's probably grass as well, so it's fine. But that doesn't really work if you're a carrier pilot. So rather than throw young men straight into the meat grinder deep in the Pacific, training carriers were commissioned. USS Sable and USS Wolverine. The first of these two strange vessels was the USS Wolverine. Rather than being built as a warship, Wolverine began life as a luxurious Great Lakes paddle wheel excursion steamer named C&B. Built by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company and launched in 1913, she was designed for the overnight passenger service between Cleveland, Ohio and Buffalo, New York, with all the accommodations, lounges and amenities of fitting a really high-end cruise vessel at the time period. At the time of her construction, C&B stood out as one of the largest and sturdiest sidewheel steamers on the lakes. But by the late 1930s, the original owning company faced, like so many others, severe financial troubles, leading to its bankruptcy in 1939. C&B was then purchased by the Chicago-based C&B, not C&B, C&B, yeah, it's very confusing, company, which continued to operate her until 1941. When the war began, the Navy, seeking a way to train pilots in controlled, safe environments without tying up of the very few and far between fleet carriers, sought to purchase the vessel. The proposal was championed by naval officers including Commander Richard F. Whitehead, and it was to convert large Great Lakes steamers into carrier training ships. The Navy acquired C&B in March 1942 and designated her as an unclassified miscellaneous auxiliary with the hull number of IX-64. And officially renamed her Wolverine on the 2nd of August 1942. Conversion work began in May in 1942 and involved stripping her entire structure and installing a steel flight deck that was roughly 550 feet long enough to practice real carrier operations, but without hangars, elevators, armor, or armament. Her paddle wheel propulsion and shallow draft gave Wolverine a distinctive silhouette compared with traditional fleet carriers, and although her top speed was, well, nothing, she proved very well suited for the purpose of pilot training. After all, the best simulation was the real thing. Wolverine was home-ported in Chicago, Illinois as part of the 9th Naval District Carrier Qualification Training Unit, say that 10 times, and because Lake Michigan was remote enough from the combat theaters of the Atlantic and Pacific, aircraft could safely take off and land on her decks in all weather conditions without enemy attacks coming from below or above the waves. In September 1942, the first carrier landing was recorded on Wolverine, and it marked the start of a rigorous training program that would continue throughout the rest of the war. And when the war ended, Wolverine would be decommissioned on the 7th of November 1945, stricken from the Naval Register later that year, and then transferred to the Maritime Commission and ultimately sold for scrapping in December 1947. Joining Wolverine on the lake, though, was USS Sable. Sable joined the Wolverine in 1943 and continued in service until late 1945. Just like Wolverine, rather than being constructed as a warship, Sable was originally built in 1924 as a sidewheel excursion steamer, the Greater Buffalo, for civilian use on the lakes. Designed and built by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio, she was one of the largest paddle steamers on the lake. In her early years, she transported passengers between Buffalo, New York and Detroit, Michigan. Greater Buffalo was acquired on the 7th of August 1942 and renamed to USS Sable, and she was commissioned in May 1943. After the conversion work, very similar to Wolverine, ripped off all of her superstructure. This work was done at the Erie plant of the American Shipbuilding Company in Buffalo. Sable's operations were based primarily on Lake Michigan as well, where she joined her sister ship Wolverine. On her very first day of flight operations, 59 pilots were qualified after each completed multiple takeoffs and landings on her decks. Pilot training continued 7 days a week in all weather conditions for years. And among those who qualified aboard the Sable was none other than George H.W. Bush, the later 41st President of the United States. Over the course of her service, Sable and Wolverine trained thousands of pilots and deck crew, and that's not hyperbolic at all. We're talking over 17,000 personnel qualified on the two ships, with Sable alone counting for tens of thousands of carrier landings during the war. These vessels hold the distinction of being the only freshwater coal-fired side-wheeled paddle-steamed aircraft carriers in US naval history. Look, there is a reason for that. They're not exactly chomping at the bit to get new ones. After the end of the war, the Sable was decommissioned on the 7th of November 1945 and struck from the Naval Register later that month. In 1948, she was sold for scrap to the H.H. Buncher Company. Despite her relatively brief naval career, her contributions to pilot training and her sister's contributions were also incredibly significant. Thank you again to patrons and Link for choosing this week's topic. Like, comment, subscribe, and I will catch you all next time.